Hola, este video es para nuestro curso en Introducción a las Culturas de Asia Sud, aquí en RUM, en Mayagüez, por semestre otoño del 2023. Este video tiene cosas súper básicas porque somos un curso subgraduado. Quiero inicialmente hacer 2 puntos. Y vamos a adelantar por la mayor parte en inglés, pero permíteme tratar de explicar unos puntos básicos inicialmente. Es posible tener la impresión que una persona quien sabe o conoce el mapa del mundo es una persona que ha estudiado estos mapas. O en otras palabras, es fácil creer que solo es necesario memorizar el mapa del mundo. Y es verdad que es buena cosa, buena idea si ustedes tienen hijos, por ejemplo, tener mapas o globos del mundo en sus cuartos, porque con este tipo de exposure es posible definitivamente aprender la geografía del mundo. Pero realmente una persona educada tiene un mapa del mundo en su mente por otras razones más fáciles. Es porque una persona educada lea, es leyendo cosas, leyendo las noticias, leyendo libros o paga atención a las noticias del mundo, los asuntos globales. Y con una vida, una práctica de vida, con leyendo, estudiando, pagando atención, la mapa del mundo es simplemente automática, es sabiduría automática. Por ejemplo, y aquí es una pregunta. ¿Qué es norte, qué es sur? ¿Es Alemania norte de Francia o es Francia norte de Alemania? No estoy interesado en sus respuestas. Eso es entre usted y la diosa, ¿verdad? Pero es una prueba básica de su conocimiento de la geografía del mundo. Y en otra vez, no necesitamos simplemente memorizar el mapa, no. Necesitamos ser personas quienes pagan atención, leyendo libros, ficción, historia, otras cosas. Es lo mismo es mi punto segundo y vamos con la presentación, pero la historia, las fechas son la misma cosa, el mismo efecto. Esta persona sabe muchas fechas, la fecha de la Revolución de Francia o la fecha del Bronze Age Collapse. Well, otra vez, esta persona no necesitamos simplemente memorizar fechas. Eso no es la manera de aprendiendo la historia. Realmente con leyendo libros, estudiando, eventualmente las fechas más importantes son obvios, son súper obvios. Mi último punto ahora, porque somos subgraduados por la mayor parte, mira, es una marca de una persona educada, que esta persona tiene una mapa del mundo en su mente y esta persona conoce varias fechas súper básicas de la historia. Y no es porque tenemos memorizar, eso es difícil, es porque leemos muchos libros de muchas fuentes. Y con esta práctica, este estilo de vida, eventualmente usted conocerá las fechas y también la mapa del mundo. Ok, so vamos con nuestra presentación súper básica hoy sobre la geografía básica del India y hinduismo. Okay. So again, destrezas básicos entender. count the years backwards, BCE, and that's roughly, traditionally, this is sort of based around the time of Christ. So we're now in the year 2023, 2023. And so that's, again, 2023 years after this baseline year that we call Common Era. Nowadays, you say CE. And before then there's many thousands of years BCE, before the Common Era, or Antes Christa, before Christ. So you count backwards, that's the point. And it's something you just need to be aware of. It can be a little tricky until you get used to it. So, Periclean Athens is in the 5th century BC, the middle of the first millennium BCE, the millennium, the 1,000 years that happened before the time of Christ. And then Plato and Aristotle are writing in the 4th century. That 4th century comes after the 5th century because you're counting backwards. So again, just a really basic thing to be aware of as we study ancient history. A lot of the stuff that we're going to look at in our class this semester happens during the first millennium BCE, los 1000 años antes la vida tradicional del Cristo. Okay, eso es el tiempo del Buddhismo y Hinduismo, the epics, the Vedas, and the things we're going to be studying. Again, just assuming that we really are starting fresh, here's a map of the world. You see Asia on the right, and at the bottom there, you see India. India is located on the Indian Ocean, and it's called the subcontinent. Just a little bit of geology. In fact, we know that the Himalayas are the highest mountain range in the world. What's happening is that there's a plate, as geology, we call this plate tectonics, that is over many, many millions of years pushing up into the bottom of the Asian continent. And that is why the Himalayas are there, because the Himalayas were formed by this plate of India pushing into the southern plate of Asia. And that's important because that Tibetan plateau, and then the Himalayas, and then the huge river plain that is India south of the Himalayas are all effects of this long-term geology. So there it is, the Indian subcontinent, as it's called. Okay, now we know where that is, and you see Europe off to the west, and China to the east, and you see Africa there off to the southwest. Okay, India is characterized, like most every place, in fact, where we find great civilizations, are riverine places where you have flooding, and then that leaves silt and fertile earth, and then people can settle there and farm and grow things. Let's look at the two biggest rivers just for a second here in India. If you look on the left, you see the Indus River Valley coming down in what is today Pakistan. And when we talk about the Indus Valley civilization, the oldest civilization in the Indian subcontinent, going back very, very far into prehistory. Prehistory before written records is what prehistory really means. So that is then, in terms of interaction with the West, that Indus Valley and Indus Valley civilization, very important. On the right, you see the Ganges, which comes down out of the Himalayas and then meanders across all this northern Great Plain of India. And so the Ganges is a sacred river for the Hindu religion, for the Indian people, enormously long a river, one of the great rivers of the world. So, and in general, India, as I say, because of those mountains to the north, India is crisscrossed with all kinds of rivers, and this is part of the reason why it's been such a fertile place for human civilization. Again, the Indus Valley civilization, over 9,000 years old. That's very, very old. Again, we're in the second millennium. We're at the beginning of the third millennium of the Common Era, 23 years into it. And then before that, you have the first millennium, and then where a lot of the classical history happens. And then getting back to the second millennium, that's sort of 3,000, 4,000 years ago, that's a very long time ago. The origins, for example, of the Chinese civilization, that's second millennium. The civilization, we have human settlements and farming in the Indus Valley, going back very, very far back into the 7th millennium BCE, which is rivaling the Egyptians, although there wasn't as large a culture in the Indus Valley as there was in ancient Egypt in, say, the 4th or 5th millennium BCE. But just looking at where we are here. It is true, though, that in the 3rd millennium BCE, and again, familiarize yourself with this, because if we're going to study ancient history, this is very important. So you have the 2000, you have the 2 millennia of the Common Era, the time that we're living. Then you have the 2 millennia before that, which are full of history, the ancient Greeks, the Persians, the Chinese, all kinds of stuff. Getting back to the 3rd millennia BCE, that's over 4,000 years ago. That's a very long time ago. So I think it's important to realize that there were large urban areas where people were settled and farming. That makes that a very, very old culture indeed in terms of world history. Then something we'll talk about, then notice 1500 BC, that is 1,500 years before the time of Christ, around the middle of what we would call the 2nd millennium BCE. And then you had this migrations of people from the northwest and came into the Indus Valley civilization. And so then you have a kind of hybrid civilization after that, where you have these Aryan ethnic people have come in, and they are having various relations, including integration, but other kinds of relations with the people that they find, the many different people that they find in the Indus Valley and beyond. Also interesting there is that a lot of language and words that we find in European languages are shared in the ancient Sanskrit language, because these people came out of the Caucasus with the same language, and that's just a fascinating topic, and we'll look at that a little bit in our class this semester. The Vedas are the founding scriptures of Hinduism. That is, the beginning of Hinduism are these devotional texts that we get after the Aryan migration in the 2nd millennium BCE, again, 1,100 and then into 500 BCE. That's the 1st millennium. Okay, so again, this is the basic outline or timeline. I like to make a joke that, in a lot of history classes, they might want you to get things pretty exactly. I hope in our class, initially at least, that we are always within about 1,000 years of what we're talking about. I don't think that's unreasonable. Then it's this 1st millennium BCE, that is 1,000 years before the time of Christ, where we get this huge development of classical culture, not only in India, but in China, in Persia, in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The Maurya Empire unifying India, and here you see its extent in the late 1st millennium. That's about the 265 BC, would be about 265 years before the time of Christ, about 150 years before the rise of the Roman civilization. Buddhism comes in the middle of the 1st millennium, again, about 2,500 years ago. That time we call it the Axial Age. We'll talk about that more too. In around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, about 500 years before traditionally what we call the time of Christ, many, many things happen in many parts of the world. Among other things, there is what's called the Sanskrit revival, a kind of renewal and liberalization of the traditional culture in India that existed at that time. Among other things, we get the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism. And we'll study that. We'll study Buddhism when we get to it, which comes out of Hinduism. Then now, around the time of the Roman Empire, that's the beginning of the 1st millennium of the Common Era. Okay, so just about 2,000 years ago. And around that time, we get the sort of golden age of Indian civilization. For us, that's significant because a lot of important philosophy and literature. When we talk about studying classical Indian philosophy, for example, this is one of the main periods that we're going to look at. It'll take us a while to get there because we're going to study the thought of the ancient Hindus, and we're going to study the basic teachings of Buddhism, and then we'll look at some classical Indian philosophy. A couple more then demographic facts. India is now the most populous country in the world with more people in it than China. This just happened recently. And India has over 1.4 billion people. So it is, and then look at the comparison with other countries there. And the United States, for example, with 340 million people, India and China both well over 1.4 billion people. That also has to do with concentrations, because the last slide here then that I'm going to show you is about the distribution of religions. It's true that the Christian and Islamic religions are the two biggest in the world, but they are also spread over very large geographical areas, as are various European languages. Whereas what we find in India and also in China are unique religious traditions and languages, but also very concentrated in one place. So that's an important thing to realize. Today, Hinduism is the third largest religion in the world. And as I say, very much concentrated in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so, all right, let me step out of that for a second. So again, just a very short video, just a couple of minutes long, but I do urge you to go back. You can go through the video and with your cursor, just pull through to the different slides. You might want to review that again and take a look at some other online sources. I very much encourage you to do that. Go and look at the timeline, BCE versus the Common Era, understand that, and understand then also the magnitude of the population of India, and that the basic religious tradition that we're talking about there is Hinduism. And we'll talk about this marvelous, colorful, beautiful Hindu iconography for some time, because it's really worth knowing about. It's a great pleasure to know about this stuff. All right, so that's just a very short, just a few minutes of recording for some basic information that I think you should know as we go on to study these things. You don't want to be in the dark about where and when things are, and someone's talking and you're really not understanding what's going on. So, and remember what I said at the beginning about la importancia de este conocimiento del mapa del mundo y la historia básica de los seres humanos en el mundo. Es una marca de una persona con conocimiento de libros y educación y es tipo de cosas es imposible. You can't fake it. You can't get around it. Okay, so pardon my bad Spanish, pero uno de mis metas este semestre es trabajar más con mi propio hablando de la lengua española. So, when your indulgence. All right. So again, go back over this again. Make sure you understand about the timeline, about basic Indian geography. Okay. And I thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.